Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next panel titled, Should Electricity Be a Right? Now, as my children, young ones would say, isn't the opposite of right wrong? So, depends on definitions and semantics, of course, but I'm delighted to be here at this very important topic because it's really about the framing of how electricity is regulated and governed that determines how cost-effective and how it plays out. I'm Rahul Tongia, a fellow at Brookings India, a scholar. I lead the Energy and Sustainability Group, and I'm especially delighted to be here with the great panel dominated by distinguished economists. I'm a non-economist, so especially nice to be here. I deal a lot with political economy and systems level, but also have been and am an engineer. We have with us, and presenting first will be Robin Burgess, who's the director IGC and a professor of economics. You've already heard him speak this morning on one topic, but we'll hear a little more on some aspects of pricing and payments, especially, if I understood correctly, Robin. And next we'll have a presentation by Anant Sudarshan, who is back to University of Chicago, but was based in Delhi at the Energy Policy Institute Chicago, EPIC in New Delhi. And Anant will also speak about some experiences from Bihar, amongst other topics. And then we have Michael Greenstone, the head of University of Chicago's Multidisciplinary Center, EPIC, who's also affiliated with a number of other institutes and has been more than just an academic, was also, for example, chief economist under President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, if I got that right. And importantly, we are delighted to have, sharing some remarks and reactions to the presentations, Mr. Lakshmanan, who is ED at Rural Electrification Corporation, REC. And so he's been on the ground in the field in Bihar and can share some quote unquote real world perspectives. Just to sort of set the tone, I know time is short, I will not take too much time. And these are my notes, I promise you no cricket scores here. Richard Stallman is famous as one of the gurus of open source for coining a phrase on freedom and rights, which says, I want software to be free, but free as in speech, not free as in beer. And so that really comes to the heart of this issue, that are we talking electricity is a right, but what does that mean? Does that mean I have the right to as much electricity as I want? At what price? Because clearly one of the challenges that people are grappling with is electricity a commodity, or is it a public utility, or to use a phrase that'll make economists cringe, a public good? And so this tension in how we govern it, how we regulate it, how we price it, how we control it, how we ration it, is really at the heart of a lot of issues for development when we come to parts of India, Africa, and around the world. It's interesting that we're having this discussion in New Delhi, which is, by most measures, the richest state in India, tying roughly with Goa. And yet New Delhi has amongst the highest subsidies, taxpayer subsidies, for electricity in the country. 3 years ago, now I think 4, they introduced subsidies up to 400 kilowatt hours per month of consumption. And that is a rather high threshold for giving subsidies. So it crosses any discussion of the concept of lifeline. Now, just last month, we have a new version of the subsidies being announced. We have a paper, an updated paper to our 2015-16 coming out, looking at what does this mean from a public policy perspective, from an incentives perspective, because at the first order, why are we subsidizing the rich? And that's a general lament in a lot of policy instruments that are taken, whether it was rooftop solar, then people are talking about electric vehicles as the next big thing, and yet we see a lot of tensions over who gets what public benefits. Are we socializing it or not? So in Delhi, the threshold is so high that, and it varies month to month, that 95% of consumers 6 months a year would get a major subsidy by the taxpayer. Clearly, for the richest state in India, that is not supporting or benefiting just the poor. It's going far worse than that in a manner that encourages inefficiency of consumption. So that's a separate problem than, of course, basic access, which we'll hear about more from the development perspective. But it's not enough just to say that this issue is a challenge of just the poor. It's also the not so poor who are caught up in this web of access, rationing, pricing, and so forth. So without further ado, I would like to invite Robin to share his presentation.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me. I guess what I'm going to try to do is sort of lay down the gauntlet of arguing that electricity is not a right, because I think that will tee us up for the remaining panel. And in the spirit of what Minouche and Jonathan said in the morning, what we're trying to do here is to sort of set out an innovative idea, which I think is not just important for India, it certainly is important for India for the reasons that Rahul already outlined, but it's also important for many other countries around the world that are struggling not only to provide access, but to provide dependable supply. So just to sort of share a few things, how the numbers are so small. This is a sort of picture from as many countries as we could gather, split out by the World Bank definition of lower middle, and so forth. And I just wanted to point to two things. The first is if you look at the lowest income countries, consumption is about 1% of the US. 1%. Okay, so that is a striking. Now, why I think that's so important is because it kind of points to a basic truth, which is that to operate any kind of modern productive activity, one needs electricity. And so this is the link to growth, that you're probably the lack of access, and even if you do have access to very patchy suppliers, it is constraining your ability to engage in productive activities. And I think that is sort of the fundamental, that 1.1 is a fundamental number that jumps out. The other thing which is interesting, if you go down a little bit, transmission and distribution losses are much, much higher in low-income countries. So this is something well beyond technical losses and so forth. This is all to do with people not paying for their electricity, stealing electricity. And as Rahul's already pointed out, this is not limited to the poorest consumers, which is a point I'll return to. So this is really a testament to this work is a testament to collaboration with Lakshmanan, who is on the panel, and other people that we've worked with for the last 7 years in Bihar, basically between the IGC EPIC JPAL team and the Department of Energy, the North and South Distribution Company. And why I think it's so important is hopefully this idea, which I'll be presenting and others will be developing, can travel around the country a bit and hopefully be exported from India. So what I'm going to do is sort of to point out first a slide that Michael shows repeatedly, that there's a strong relationship between GDP and energy, a very strikingly strong relationship. And of course, it's not a causal relationship, but I think it goes back to that 1% and just sort of imagining if you were without electricity, what kinds of employment and productive activities you might engage in wherever you're based. And I think it really brings into sharp focus that the lack of access to electricity is probably a major constraint on economic growth. Things tend to get worse before they get better in terms of losses. So this is showing across the world access to electricity against T&D losses. And the reason for that is fairly easy to understand, which is if you're in a situation where you're making losses on each new customer, then of course as access improves, losses go up. And until you really get a handle on reducing losses, that remains the case. So in other words, to get to high access, you ultimately have to bring down losses, because the fundamental point we're going to make today is that if you operate a business where you're only making back 30 cents on every dollar on energy spent, that is, that's not a viable proposition. And not just a viable proposition for distribution, it's also not a viable proposition for generation, because if you're selling to a loss-making business, that's an unattractive thing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is very quickly basically take you through 4 steps that lead to this situation, this sort of broken electricity situation. So it's sort of basically what we have in the world, put very starkly, is 2 worlds of electricity. There's the world of electricity that Michael and I inhabit in the UK and the US, where we have 24-hour electricity, everybody has electricity as much as you want, basically. And then the world that people in Bihar inhabit, which is where, recently access has increased, but supply is very, very patchy. And what I want to sort of set out is a sort of an argument as to how you get, so as we heard yesterday in the workshop, the ambition in India is to move from one world to the other. And to understand how we might make that, I have to kind of describe how we got into the broken electricity world. And so the first thing, which is to me quite paradoxical, is that it's actually the root cause of this, is that people view electricity as a right. And by a right, I mean something that they should receive without having to pay for it. So it's completely unlike, say, cell phones, where we wouldn't imagine using our cell phones without paying for them. This is treated as something quite distinct, and not just by poor consumers, by a whole range of consumers, including industrial consumers. So just to sort of, we're going to go through these 4 steps, and I'm going to finish with, very preliminary ideas on how you might confront this problem, and then that will be sort of expanded upon by the members of the panel. So this is just some from survey data in Bihar, and what's striking, if you look at the last column, this is sort of the people's view of whether there would be any penalty associated with these activities. So these are all, at least for the bottom 3, are all illegal activities. So modifying the meter, having an informal hook connection, bribing electricity officials. Basically, people view, the majority of people, the vast majority, don't think there will be any penalty associated with engaging in these activities. So of course, that can be viewed as, well, we view stealing electricity, not paying for electricity, as something which is the norm. And so at a fundamental level, what we're interested in is not just technological fixes, it's actually changing that social norm of people viewing electricity as a right. But this is just evidence, this is sort of step 1, that people do view electricity as a right. And then these are marginal prices for electricity from a whole range of, so what we did is we scraped the internet to look at pricing of electricity by different utilities and different quartiles of the income distribution across the world. And a couple of things that are noticeable. One is that people pay less for the lowest income countries for the electricity, but also because consumption is lowest, that you have these sort of lifeline or subsidized prices, because consumption is so much lower in developing or lowest income countries, the majority or more of the population is in that heavily subsidized area. So even without stealing or not paying for your bill, you're already almost arriving in a position where the distribution company is not making a profit on electricity distribution. So even without those additional activities, you're already in a losing position. So this is, again, the pricing is sort of evidence that electricity is seen as a right. And then this is really fascinating. So this is from administrative data that we gathered along with Lakshmanan when he was in Bihar. And what's fascinating is it's showing monthly consumption of electricity with about 100 kilowatts being the norm. But what we see is across that whole distribution of electricity consumption, the dotted line is how much people are paying. So there's 2 things that are striking. One is that the revenue, so this is the amount of money you receive back on energy injected, is only at about 40%. Right? So but what's even more striking is that it's across the whole energy consumption schedule. So even rich domestic consumers, industrial consumers are not paying for their electricity, even when they're billed. So this is showing when you're billed how much you pay. So that's a sort of really a very striking demonstration that people are basically find it normal not to pay for their electricity. So what's the sort of first consequence of that? Well, the first consequence is, of course, as I've already indicated, that you're starting with the official rates. So these are electricity rates in Bihar. Starting with the official rate, you immediately drop below the cost of supply just from legal explicit subsidies. But then there's a small drop from technical losses, which even utilities in the UK and the US suffer from, but it's very, very small. The really big drops after that are people not paying for their power when billed, and then stealing electricity. So the first is stealing electricity in terms of, you have this sort of steps down into insolvency, if you like, from this behavior. And noticeably, all of these are subject to policy. So how much you subsidize electricity, whether you confront theft, whether you confront people not paying for their bill. They're all basically dependent on, it's not an engineering problem. This is a human behavior policy problem. But you end up with a very small fraction of electricity being paid for. And as the consequence of electricity distribution companies losing so much money is they can lose money, and they ultimately have to be bailed out by the state for all that money lost. But ultimately, you can't lose an infinite amount of money. So what do? There's only one thing you can do, and that's to ration supply. And so what you see is that in India, this is cumulative distribution, is that nobody basically receives 24-hour electricity. Okay? But the areas such as the urban areas receive more, but the median's sort of in 10, 12 hours of electricity. So you're ending up with a situation where, as a result of people viewing electricity as a right, the bulk of the consumers in the economy, both domestic and industrial, are not getting the electricity they want. So there's two things here, and it's important to know there's two things. One is electricity is viewed as a right, which we've seen some evidence for. But the second thing is that it's not excludable. We all have to source electricity from the same grid. So even if I was perfectly willing to pay more for electricity, full price, make the utility profitable, because I have real use for that electricity, 24-hour electricity, I'm unable to do so. Because the electricity distribution companies have no option to limit their losses but to ration supply. And this is something, as we saw in the first table, that you see across the developing world, and in effect divides the world into this sort of broken electricity markets that you experience in developing countries and electricity markets in developed countries, where it wouldn't cross my mind in the UK, for example, not to pay my electricity bill, because I know exactly what would happen. There would be no more electricity. Okay, and then just to finish up, the consequence of this is ultimately that the state has to bail out the distribution companies. And so what we observe is something which is completely antithetical to markets, which is in Bihar, this is data for each feeder in Bihar, which serves about 2,500 households. There is simply no relationship between how much you pay as a feeder and how many hours of electricity you receive. Right? So if we thought of it as a developed country, the developed country would have revenue rates of 1. You'd pay for all the electricity you receive, and you would all get 24 hours of electricity. Whereas here, there's simply no relationship between how much you pay and how many hours you receive. And what does that do? Well, that reaffirms the view that why on earth would you want to pay for your electricity? So essentially, electricity becomes politicized. So in the next chart, we see peaks in electricity supply and public holidays, because ultimately the state is the payer of last resort, and the state is controlling where electricity goes. So it doesn't go to places where there's the greatest demand. It simply goes to places which are demanding the most electricity, have the greatest political power, and so forth. So this is something, this picture here is sort of a picture of how a market should not work, right? Because you're not rewarding people who or in this case, feeders that pay for their electricity. So to finish, and this is stolen from Michael's slides yesterday, there's basically 4 steps. People feel that electricity should be provided by the government without them having to pay. That leads to low payment rates. Distribution companies lose money, and to limit losses, they ration supply. So you end up with this sort of vicious circle which reinforces the view that electricity is a right. And I think what is important here is that this is a situation which is by no means limited to Bihar or to India. This is a situation which we're confronting with the IGC in Myanmar, we're confronting with the IGC in Pakistan, people are confronting in Ghana. And I think it's something which we need to think, and I won't be getting into that side of things, how do we get people out of this very bad equilibrium? And sort of 2 possible ways is obviously to improve supply, and as Anant's going to be talking about that, but also to increasing government commitment to treating electricity as a commodity, so cutting down on theft, non-payment and the like. So if we think about sort of very broad classes of policies, you've got one which is you need to rationalize these subsidies, because in effect, as Rahul was saying, it's by no means the poor that enjoy them, so there needs to be some sort of rationalization. There's a lot of discussion of defined benefits as a way of doing that, of sort of packaging up the subsidy the poor would have received and making sure it's only the poor that receive that subsidy doesn't spread across the whole income distribution. There's the changing the social norm, where we've been experimenting in Bihar on how to do that, using a large RCT, which Anant will talk about. There's, for example, incentivizing bill collectors, because there's often collusion between the collector and the consumer to enable the consumer not to pay. And then there's also something which Michael will be describing, which is, there is alternatives now. There's off-grid solar and so forth, and that might scoop up some of the people who have relatively low demand for electricity, and make sure that, because with off-grid solar, it's entirely private. You pay for the panel, and then you obtain the energy from that. And then finally, a whole bunch of interventions which have been described, and discussed across India to do with technology, whether that's prepaid meters, smart meters, which are all really about monitoring and enforcement. That you, for example, can remotely switch off somebody's electricity if they break some non-payment norm. And finally, something which is sort of certainly big in the developed countries, which is thinking about how to avoid the peaks, encouraging people to use electricity at different times of day, or just using behavioral interventions to change this norm of electricity as a right. But I think I'll now turn it over to Anant.
Thank you. So, do we have slides up here? So we may not have slides up here, so let me just start off, and then hopefully they'll come up at some point. So I'm going to talk about a project that we did in Bihar. And the idea was to say, can we break this vicious cycle that Robin laid out through one idea? So of course, there are many ways in which you might be able to break this vicious cycle. And I'll talk about one thing that we tried. I think the important thing about what Robin was talking about is when you look at the problem that way, you start coming up with different solutions, whether they are successful or not, that are framed around this idea of how do I make people think of electricity not as a right. Right, so I think the starting point is we know that India has made tremendous progress in the last few years as far as electricity distribution is concerned. We've heard a lot about it. This is some data from 2014 and then 2017 in Bihar. And of course, things have improved even further. But what has mostly changed is what has changed in these two figures is that red bar on the extreme left, which is people who are not connected to the grid at all. And that's come down a lot. But you look at these two figures and you see for those who are connected to the grid, the quality hasn't changed that much. And now, that's not to say it's completely static. Since 2017, things have improved.
But you see these two different worlds are moving at very different speeds. Your ability to supply power to people that you've connected has not improved anywhere near as fast as your ability to just hook them up to the wires. And so the project that we set out to try was to sort of say, can we reduce the losses that our utility partners in Bihar are undergoing with, in partnership with and looking at some of the ideas that they came up with. And through reducing those losses, can we make it possible to supply more power and move that distribution further to the right? So just give you a sense of where Bihar was when this project started, and also how much it's moved today. When the project started, about 42% of power that was injected into the distribution grid by the utility never sent any money back, right? And that's what, the technical term is aggregate and technical and commercial losses. A lot of that is people not paying their bills or people stealing power and so on, and some of that is technical issues. Today in 2019, it's 27%. But those numbers are still huge. I mean, to put this in context, it's well below 10%, say, in the United States, and that's all technical losses, right? And you could reasonably argue that if you don't have high quality supply, you may not get many of the benefits that electrification brings. So you can't really set up a business if I have 12 hours of intermittent supply. So in some sense, for many productive activities, it's almost as good as having no electricity at all if the quality of electricity isn't as nice as we'd like, right? I can't stock ice creams to sell in a village if my freezer is going to stop working half the day, right? Then I might as well not have electricity at all. So the project we undertook with both the North and South Bihar distribution companies, and Mr. Lakshmanan here really led this effort while we were working there, was in sort of 8 districts across Bihar, so a really huge project, and a randomized control trial running across this very large portion of the state. I don't know why these bullet points have got cut off, but tens of millions of people affected. And when we started this project, what we found, and this is a figure that Robin put up as well, was that essentially there's no relationship between how much people pay and how much electricity they get. So these are two different worlds. And you do have parts of the state which are paying, their bills almost in entirety, and many of them are getting, very few hours of electricity per day. And then you have people paying almost nothing and getting nearly 24 hours. So there's no return to your decision to pay. And so essentially that's the idea of this project, which is to say, if we're going to ration, we don't have the money to supply 24/7 to everybody, but if we have to ration, let's ration in a way that makes more economic sense, in the sense of giving people an incentive to pay by giving those who pay more power and giving those who don't pay less, while retaining the total amount of hours of supply. So it's a very simple idea. It essentially means you look at these payment rates scattered all over. You divide them into bins. On the x-axis here is the fraction of the cost of electricity that's recovered. So you divide this into bins. Each bin is given a different number of hours of supply. So that's just a rule now. If you pay between 60 and 80%, you get so many hours of supply. If you pay between 0 and 20%, you get a smaller number. And we compared this to a control group, which is drawn from those same parts of the state, those same feeders. And the control group, everybody got the same hours of supply, and the total, the average is the same. So the average hours of supply in the treatment is the same as the control. It's just that the rationing is done differently, right? And then this was sort of marketed, vigorously. We had sort of bill inserts, posters, plays, announcements, songs, all sorts of things. The idea being that you want people to know this exists, right? I did not do any singing, thankfully. But we had some people singing. So what happened, right? So this is a tough problem we are trying to solve. So this is the effort we made. What happened? So one thing we did see was that in the places where we implemented this scheme, and let me just back up a little bit to sort of set out two ways in which this might change how much money you make. Now, one reason it'll change how much money you make is now you're sending your electricity, hopefully, to the people who tend to pay more, right? So that's an allocation mechanism. And the other sort of deeper thing that you're trying to change is you're trying to make people see that there's a cost to not paying for power, and therefore change the way they think about electricity. And I think this project got part of the way there. And in doing so, I think underlines the central issue that Robin was making, which is how do you make people think differently, which is a hard problem. So what we did see in the areas where we implemented this, now let me explain that rather noisy graph to you. The blue line is the revenue per feeder, the total amount of revenue in thousands of dollars per feeder. A feeder is a portion of the electricity grid that serves about 5 to 7 villages in these areas. So the blue line and the red line are the revenues you get from feeders that are under this rationing system, that's the blue, and feeders that are not under this rationing system where everybody is getting the same regardless of how much they pay. Right? And before this project starts, you can see in the extreme left between April and September, both of these lines are right on top of each other, and that's what you'd expect because both of these groups are pulled out at random in the population that we are looking at, right? So this is a randomized controlled trial, so they are identical by construction, and that's what you see. Now, once we started this project, you kind of see a divergence. In these places where rationing was now tied to how much you paid, you see more revenues coming in from there. And in the treatment feeders where you didn't have this relationship, you see that red line lies below the blue line, right? Now this project ran for a while, and a lot of stuff happened during that portion of time, which sort of also underlines the fact that it's difficult to implement this kind of project for the sorts of reasons that Robin was talking about, that because you don't have a market, you're still talking about allocating rations to different people. There's always this push and pull between allocating along this kind of rule, which is trying to get the idea in of paying being important, and allocation based on other reasons, which maybe it's hot, maybe there's an election coming up. So you see on this figure, I've marked an assembly election over there, and the time of the assembly election, you also see these two lines start converging again. And that's also a time when this project had to be suspended, right? And it's not surprising. The electricity is a big part of the political process, and you do want to provide people more power, right? So it was suspended then, and then we started it, after that, and these lines move apart a little bit, and the project ended in 2017, which is that last vertical line, right? So this is noisy, these things go up and down, but it does seem to be the case that you could extract more revenue from these feeders, and that's really important because if you can extract more revenue, you can then buy more power, and then you can buy more power, you can sort of start moving from low power, low revenues to what you really want, which is higher power, higher revenues. Right? There was a lot of variation in how people responded. So North Bihar was particularly responsive to this scheme, South Bihar less so. And so I've pulled this out to show you what lies underneath that average graph. So in North Bihar, the change in revenues was much more significant, and these areas where this rationing scheme was put in place also started to pay more, also started to consume more power. Right? But what didn't change so much, and as I said right at the beginning, there are sort of two mechanisms through which this acts, right? So one mechanism is sending your power to different people, but the other mechanism is conditional on getting power, am I more likely to pay a higher fraction of my bill, right? Because I've sort of got this message in my head that you should pay, and that should apply to everybody. Now, what we didn't see in this project was a particularly significant change in the probability that you would pay, say, 80% of your bill as opposed to 60%. So you've got everybody paying some range of amount. There's I'm paying nothing at all, and Robin's paying 60%. And although you have this messaging coming in, you do make more money by sending it to the right people, quote unquote, but I don't think we managed to change attitudes to the extent that we hoped for when we started this idea. And I think that that just underlines how important it is that everything that's going on in the world is sort of pushing in the same direction. So, for example, if you have political messaging that is not saying the same things, that you need to pay for power, then you're kind of fighting against headwinds over there. Or in the state of New Delhi, when you have electricity subsidies that are given, even if supposedly to lower consumers. In fact, as Rahul said, it's 95% of the population benefits from that. It's very hard when you have that going on at the same time to try and convince people through something else that they should pay. Right? But as I said, we're now trying a whole bunch of things to move this even further, and some of them are looking fairly successful. I don't have them up here. Maybe next year. So that's all I wanted to go through. And I think now I'll turn it over to Michael, who's got some interesting stuff from a completely different angle of attack, so to speak.
Thank you. So a lot of the slides that Anant and Robin had shown were part of a paper where Anant is also a co-author. And so you're welcome. I encourage you to look at the IGC website, which has the paper. And in that paper, they use an analogy to ice cream, that of course you have to pay for it. But Michael, free ice cream tastes better than paid ice cream. There is a difference.
There is. Just someone has to make the ice cream.
Yeah. Details.
Okay, so what I'm going to, maybe, I was actually looking at my old emails on the flight over here. And I realized my first trip to Bihar was in 2013. And so I think what today is about is unveiling some of the things that we've learned over the last 6 years, maybe finally starting to make these papers public. And Robin covered an important one, and Anant covered another one. And I'm now going to talk about one that is related, but takes advantage of all the work that we did with the Bihar distribution companies. So this is demand for electricity in a poor economy, and Robin evidently broke into my computer and stole this figure, but I'll just make the point that the world, maybe I'll try to say it more dramatically than he did, the world has no examples of countries achieving high levels of living standards without consuming a lot of energy. And that comes out loud and clear here. So it feels like, as Rob noted, it's not necessarily a causal relationship, but it feels like finding a way to lots of energy is going to be critical to people in India and other parts of the world achieving living standards that are so urgent for them to achieve. As further background, over 1 billion people around the world are not connected to the grid. The numbers for India are outdated because of the remarkable progress that India has made in the last few years. But even more, and this came across in some of the figures that you saw a few minutes ago, maybe it's 800 or 900 million now, but there's many hundreds of millions, dare I say, a couple billion, of people who do not have 24/7, 365 access. But what we're going to focus on, and what we focus on in this paper, in particular, is what's going on in rural areas. And I think the problem of electrification and supply in rural areas, I like to think of it as a durable problem. It's been around for several decades, and it hasn't really gone away. But it feels like an especially important moment to take a look at it again, because there are 3 very large shifts that are occurring in rural areas around the world. The first, which I just made mention of a minute ago, is the incredible increase in connections. Now, mind you, connections are not the same as electricity flowing to the connection, but connections, and now India has effectively moved to a place where there are no longer people who are not connected to the grid due to remarkable efforts. The second seismic shift, and this is just, the next slide is just to say, hey, this is not India. only. Lots of other countries around the world are engaged in efforts to connect people to the grid. The second seismic shift, I think, has been unprecedented and I think unpredictable decline in solar costs. And so they've declined, they're now a half a percentage point of what they were at the beginning of this figure in 1977. And that has raised the specter of, well, could solar be part of the answer, particularly in rural areas, where it might be especially expensive to connect people to the grid. And plus, of course, solar has the benefit that does not involve the release of CO2 or burning of fossil fuels. And there's all these quotes, often from NGOs, not from people who live in developing countries, about how we could leapfrog, just like we did with the cell phone, and jump from relying on the grid to solar mini-grids. So that's the second seismic shift. And the third has been the remarkable increase in incomes in India over the last several decades, and in several other countries as well. So what we want to try and do in this paper is, while acknowledging those kind of seismic changes in the electricity landscape, ask what do people actually want themselves, instead of people in Geneva deciding what would be a great idea for people in poor countries. What if we actually went and estimated demand for electricity in rural settings? And the setting that we did this in, of course, was in rural Bihar. And what we try to do is estimate individuals' demand for electricity. Now, I'll tell you this, several things that came out of it. But I just want to emphasize, if you don't understand what people's demand curve looks like, it's impossible to devise policy that is going to be most beneficial for them. Okay, so the first thing that we found, which maybe reflected my naivete, surely not my co-author's naivete, was that in rural areas, there's an incredibly rich market for power or electricity. I think we had in our mind, well, there's just people sitting in the dark, and of course, if we come and sell a reduced price solar microgrid, everyone's going to want it. It's got to be better than that. And what turned out is that's not really true. And in fact, there's a very active market. There are 4 main technologies that are available there. The grid is one. It's not available at the time that we conducted this. It wasn't available everywhere. The second are these incredibly entrepreneurial diesel generator guys. They have a diesel generator. They come to a village. They hook up wires to people's homes. They need about 60 homes to buy in. And then they supply electricity that roughly mimics the hours of, at the time of what was available on the grid. Then there's own solar, that's you put a panel on your own house, and there are solar microgrids. And so we came up, first finding from this was that, well, it's a pretty rich environment. And if you really want to understand demand, you're going to have to understand how people make substitution choices. You know, if the hours that one of them is available changes, people might not substitute to no electricity, they might substitute to a different form of electricity. Okay, and let me just parenthetically add as support to Robin's presentation, one thing that's just worth noting right from the very start is that B, C, and D, the diesel, own solar, and the microgrid, they serve power just like the grid does, but people pay for it. People understand very well that you'll be cut off if you don't have it. And so there's not something magical about electricity. It's something about electricity that's being provided by the government. So back to our regular programming here. Let's just talk about what we did to estimate demand. So I think we have the most comprehensive data set ever compiled on both the demand and supply sides in a rural setting. This was put together by our cooperation with Husk Power, who sells solar microgrids, cooperation with the distribution companies in Bihar, and we collected this data for 100 villages. Now the key thing that we did is we randomized the price for the solar microgrids. We did this in collaboration with Husk Power. And an especially appealing feature of it is that this randomized price lasted for 4 years. So it's not as if we put one form of electricity on sale for a month or 2 months and asked what would happen. People lived with these different prices, and we were able to track what happened. So let me just try and give you a sampling. There's probably an embarrassment of results from this paper, but let me just give you a sampling of what pops out of it. So the first thing, and again, this was probably our naivete when we began and we didn't understand there were all these substitution opportunities. We thought that it would be sufficient to just estimate people's take-up for the solar microgrid. And here we're reporting it at 200 rupees, 160 rupees, and 100 rupees. You could think of the true market price as at about 200 rupees. And what you can see is there's no demand at the true market price. If you subsidize it enough, you can get people to do it. And this is a funny demand curve. This is, did you buy it just at least once over the course of the 4 years? And now what I want you to see through the power of PowerPoint animation is, well, when we look 2 years into the study, actually it looks a lot different. Demand started to shift in, and even at the subsidized price, people were not very happy to buy this. And then by the end, there's almost no demand for this product. There's maybe 7 or 8 percentage points of people who are doing it. And I think when we set out, we thought this would be sufficient, but as we learned more about what was going on, we were left with a very important question. Well, what's going on in the background? The grid is expanding drastically. The diesel generator operators are in some villages, not others. Maybe these choices that people are revealing here are going to be determined by the substitution opportunities that they have. And indeed, particularly if you want to make predictions about what the world might look like after incomes grow, or if solar prices decline more, or if the grid expands more, you have to understand these substitution opportunities. So that set us to this kind of demand system estimation, where we very specifically accounted for these substitution opportunities. And 4 main things came away from this. The first is that the consumers in rural Bihar are extraordinarily price sensitive. And indeed, what they appear to be revealing is that the benefit to them of electrification is not terribly high. That's not, if they were richer, they might want it more, but given their current income levels. And so one way to put a very fine point on that is that even a 10 rupee per month increase in the cost of the grid would reduce the grid's market share from 24% by 3 percentage points off of a base of 24 percentage points. And so for those of you who are not good, who aren't good with rupees, you can think of that as like 2 cups of tea or 3 bananas. And so that's the environment that is kind of the status quo, where you have very, very price-sensitive consumers and who do not appear to be gaining a ton from electrification. And it's also clear that the government is losing quite a bit by supplying electricity there. And sorry, I'm kind of giving the second point that comes away from this is that the grid's value and market share depends radically on the price subsidies. So if the grid were entirely removed, that would be beneficial in that the government would no longer lose money, but it would also cause some decline in electrification, but not as much as you might think, because people would find themselves substituting to solar. And indeed, removal of the grid would only lead to a modest decline in electrification. If the grid, alternatively, its price were raised to cover its costs, its market share would decrease from 24 percentage points to 7 percentage points. So it's almost the case that an unsubsidized grid wouldn't exist. It's almost equivalent to an unsubsidized. If you didn't subsidize it, it's almost as if it wouldn't exist. It's also true that the fact that the grid does exist, I think, is evidence that the government sees great political value in it and possibly some vision of what's coming ahead. And I'm going to come to that in a minute. And then the third point that comes out of this analysis is that the value of solar is tied very closely to whether or not there's a grid. So consumers' preferences for solar greatly depend on whether or not the grid is present. So if the grid is not present, the surplus from buying solar is about twice as high as then when the grid is absent. There's also this other thing that the presence of the grid actually benefits the government by drawing away some customers. And since each customer is a loss-making enterprise, there's some benefit to the government's balance sheet from that. Okay, the last point that comes across, and I think is actually probably the most important because it's the most forward-looking one, is that we ask, well, what happens, so we can kind of understand their people's choices today, what happens if people become richer? And India, and particularly Bihar, is undergoing very explosive economic growth. And we did a counterfactual exercise where if people moved up, just say from the 20th percentile of the income wealth distribution in Bihar today, and moved to say the 80th percentile, which is not very rich by urban standards or even certainly by other parts of India, you would see a massive increase in the use of the grid. And that would also be accompanied by a large decline in the fraction of households who are not electrified, and very little, really only a modest change in the fraction of households who are using solar. And so what we take away from that is that what people really want as they become wealthier is to have the grid that people, all of us, are used to in some way. A grid that runs with some frequency, a grid that can run appliances that require lots of energy. And so coming back to these kind of three mega trends that are influencing the electricity sector, it is true that solar is driving down, the prices of solar are coming down dramatically, but if you go to people in rural villages and infer their demand from their behavior, which we did, what they're trying to say is what they really want in the long run as they become wealthier is the grid. And that's kind of the punchline of our paper. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now I'd like to request Mr. Lakshmanan to share some thoughts, reactions, and also perhaps some newer thoughts, because electricity is a moving target. Many things are continuously changing, both at a state level and at a central level.
Thank you, Rahul. In fact, since last 6 months, I've moved to Delhi and I've started working for Rural Electrification Corporation as the executive director. Prior to that, for almost 4.5 years, I'd been working as managing director of the distribution company in Bihar. So it's more contextual that I'm also in the panel along with Robin, Michael, and Anant. We have had the opportunity to work together. We were quite open in terms of sharing data, working with them, and it was a very interesting and a fruitful partnership. It gave us a lot of insights. Probably whatever the inferences they had based on the survey, study, and the statistics. Probably I would like to bring a perspective from a practitioner's point of view. How did we look at it? How did we go about it? As a country, we have made significant progress in terms of access. But then, the logical progression is what is the quality of access? Where do we stand on that? So probably the goal moving forward is to look at quality, reliable, and uninterrupted power supply 24/7. So if we have to actually work towards that goal, probably the paradox which was brought about, treating electricity as a commodity. Is electricity a right? Unless this is resolved, probably it will be very, very difficult to achieve the next progressive goal. probably I will pick up some examples of the journey of, of the two biggest states in India. Bihar from my own personal experience, and some, facts from Uttar Pradesh, UP. In Bihar, over the last 5 years, just to give you a, background where we were and where we moved. And along the way, what were the factors that actually influenced the movement. In 2014-15, the peak demand of Bihar was around 2200 megawatt. And along with that, we had around 64 lakh consumers. And then if you take the present scenario, and the hours of power supply then was probably in the rural areas was around 8 to 10 hours. In some places even going below 8 hours. Probably in 19, this figure stands at we have 1.45 crore or 145 lakh consumers. We have almost added close to 1 crore consumers in this span of 5 years. And the peak demand of Bihar has gone up to almost close to 6,000 megawatts from 2,200. And correspondingly, the hours of power supply has also moved up. Even in rural areas today, probably people are getting around 18 to 20 hours of power supply. In this journey, the key question is what happens to your losses? Because you are expanding access to population, which is actually not paying. That is the ultimate behavior that we are seeing. People are not paying, but then one need to get into the details of why is that behavior? Why are people not paying? So, as we began this journey, we were also new to the sector. So the preliminary impression that you get is people don't want to pay, people take it as a right. I would, significantly agree to that perception, but then we thought that was the only reason. But then it is not. As we, got into the nuts and bolts of it, that was a segment where we were almost making 80% losses. Of course, the overall loss at that point of time was 43, but then if you break it into consumer categories, that was a, segment in which we were making almost 80% or close to that was the losses in that segment. And we were expanding the supply to that area. Probably the sales mix of this segment was around 10% at that point of time. And as we progressed, that 10% increased to almost 35%. So you are practically expanding supply from 10 to 35 on those areas where you are making 85% losses. So it is quite natural that as you expand access, your technical and commercial losses, keep growing up because you are expanding access to a segment which is not contributing to your revenues. So once you analyze the consumer behavior, why is the consumer not willing to pay? There are very simple reasons, but then you'll have to understand and address that unless, if you want to move forward and resolve this, probably improve the situation. One is as a company, as a distribution utility, since that was contributing very less to your revenues because you were losing 80%, probably people were not paying attention to that segment. So as a result, your revenue systems, the metering, billing, collection systems in those areas were practically non-existent or was very, very weak. So as a result, people did not get regular bills. People sitting here in Delhi who are living, probably everybody gets a monthly bill. But then in most of the rural areas, people get bills once in 6 months, once in 8 months, very irregular, infrequent. So for a segment of population which is, low on the economic rung, if you give a bill monthly of, 300, 400 rupees, people find it, convenient to pay, they are willing to pay. But then the same bill, if it is served after 6 months, 8 months, accumulated bill of, probably 4,000, 5,000, then, they don't have the ability to pay. Though they might be willing to pay, but then they don't have the ability to pay. And second is since of, poor systems in place, poor monitoring, poor attention to these areas, the bills that were served also were incorrect. They were inflated bills, incorrect bills, wrong bills. So people, inherently did not trust the bills that they were receiving. They felt these are wrong bills, so they didn't feel justified to pay it. They wanted a rectification of the bill, which you and I would also, that is a normal human behavior. Third aspect which added to it was going 5 years behind, the quality of power supply. People were getting voltage levels of 150, 140 volts at which power was being supplied, with multiple interruptions during the day, 6 hours, 8 hours of electricity. So that practically meant nothing to them because the quality was so poor, they did not feel that they were receiving any service. So if you, add these three things together, probably the end result is, people don't feel justified, morally obliged to pay. So we started working on each of these issues in terms of, improving the quality of power supply. There was a lot of input which was getting into the infrastructure segment in terms of augmenting, strengthening, and extending the access. We could have significant improvements along the way, reaching 18-20 hours of power supply in rural areas. And of course, the quality has improved, if not up to the urban areas, but then significant improvement in quality. Similarly, we brought in a new IT platform, a new mobile technology intervention in terms of billing, which probably resulted in people getting relatively much more regular bills on a monthly basis for a significant portion of the people. And then with the intervention of technology, the billing accuracy also improved. The earlier habit of people not actually going to the house to take a meter reading, that was handled, so people got correct bills, timely bills. So just to probably like supplement this with a statistic. When we did this intervention in 16-17, that was the time we started handling this issue. So at that point of time, April 17, the rural area revenues in Bihar was around 96 crores. We got 96 crores in April 17 from the rural area consumers. And as this initiatives progressed, things improved. By December 17, the revenue from the same segment went up to 192 crores, almost like from 96 crores to 192 crores. So, the point which I am trying to, emphasize is like if you handle the issues which are contributing to the consumer's behavior in a systemic manner, then probably like, you address a significant portion of the people's psyche of, taking electricity as an entitlement. So at least like as a first step, they feel, they are getting a proper service for which they must pay. So that is the first step. And then probably like, overall the political setup and environment also contributes to the people's thinking, whether it's a public good or whether it's a commodity. So in that aspect also, like the government in Bihar was quite supportive. The Honorable Chief Minister himself at many forums, whenever he used to, tell people that we are improving the electricity supply, but then you have to pay. So that statement also, makes a huge difference politically, like message is getting across to the people. That along with, the utilities improving their own inefficiencies contribute to a overall progress and improving the situation. The 14-15 AT&C loss figures of Bihar was around 43.7, which moved to 39.7 in the next year. Again, because of expanding access, typically the curve which Robin showed, where utilities get stuck up. The next year again, we could not bring down our losses. We were at 39.4 for the next consecutive year. Then when we made these interventions and tried to break this cycle, then next year we had a significant reduction in loss of around 7%. We came down to 33. And then in the current year, we have further come down to 27. So probably like, all these things put together, if you work consistently and persistently on all these measures in terms of your efficiencies and improvement in systems, at the same time working with people to, make sure that they realize that it's not a, entitlement, they'll have to pay for it. And so that, brings in a probably a decreasing trajectory of losses, which makes it more viable and sustainable for utilities to supply power. And probably in the current year, Bihar is looking at 2 quarters have gone by. So the figures which we hear from Bihar, probably like we are looking at a AT&C loss of 22 to 23% by the end of this fiscal year. So that's a significant progress. So just to conclude, to quote UP similarly had figures of 26.4. With expanding access, actually this went up to 30, and then it dipped to 27, and it is at 24 now. So probably UP is hovering in a band. They'll have to actually break this cycle and probably like dip further. So, and probably like going forward, in terms of the other solutions which were flagged, prepaid smart metering is one, key thing which many of the utilities are taking it up, which again, typically makes it a commodity. If you don't pay, your electricity gets switched off on its own. So that's a huge technological intervention, probably, which will drive this sector forward. And another key thing is DBT, which again, Government of India is very keen on pursuing. We'll have to see how exactly the modalities, work out in terms of rolling out DBT. Probably these two key steps would go a long way in making this sector more sustainable and viable, which ultimately will lead to a possibility of having quality uninterrupted power supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lakshmanan. So we have a little bit of time, so the format I think will be, before we come to the audience, share a few questions for some discussion amongst the panelists and participants before we open it up to the audience, and then bring it back for any burning closing thoughts that anyone may have. Ideally, especially two things request. One is either what don't we know, which is always music to the ears of a scholar or academic, but also where could government effort shift to, because things are moving and shifting. So just a few thoughts I'll just open with, because a lot of the issues are linked. It's not sufficient just to pick a statistic or an anecdote. So it is a cyclical issue on behavior, as you mentioned. The feeder, for those who don't quite grasp it, is really the smallest size at which quality is determined. So that is the substation which connects a large number of consumers, one line, which could be a few thousand households, it could be one large industry. So that is the level at which load shedding, that's the Indian euphemism, or brownouts, are controlled. So one of the questions is, and it's there in the paper, is of course, is that fair? Because why am I being penalized for my damn neighbors who may or may not behave? And so one of the other questions that this leads to is, going forward, the government has announced plans for smart meters, which would actually allow much more granular both measurements, but more than measurements, it would also allow granular control. So I can actually give gold service, silver service, platinum service, no service, depending on people's willingness to pay, for example. The big other challenge is, if you consume a little bit of electricity, it is expensive to serve you. It doesn't matter whether you go from any of the 4 technologies that you alluded to. Your fixed costs actually dominate your cost structure. Your last mile, if you have a rooftop solar, you avoid the last mile, but then you need more storage, you need more over-engineering to give you a quality supply. So somewhere there is a cost associated. So there's no free lunch. But the question then becomes, what is the right mechanism to, quote unquote, socialize this or manage this? One of the other things I didn't hear enough on was, right now we're looking at households in all of these data. So households have their own block or tier telescopic slabs. So it's cross-subsidized for the lowest. The highest tier may actually pay quite a lot. I don't know the Bihar tariffs offhand, but that's true across most of India. But in addition to cross subsidies within a within a consumer category, you also have huge cross subsidies between residents and other. Now, agriculture, of course, is cross subsidized in the other direction. It's heavily subsidized. But industrial and commercial users dramatically overpay in most of India. So is one of the challenges in these underserved areas, including Bihar, Jharkhand, is it just that you don't have other, quote unquote, paying customers? Is that a dynamic that will resolve itself going over time? And the last sort of thread that ties it together is really this quantum on willingness to pay. You showed numbers, Michael, of if it costs, let's say, 100 and change, 115 rupees a month, and maybe people pay 100, 160, or 200, the quantum of electricity they consume is relatively modest. So the per kilowatt hour cost looks very high. So is that the right framing? So should we be looking at the total household bill, or should we be comparing rupees per kilowatt hour, because that will grow, the kilowatt hours will grow over time. So with these sorts of opening thoughts, you've painted a picture of the equilibrium today. How might that change? Because Robin, you sort of alluded to that curve that's just, the reverse Kuznets curve. It's going to get worse, but is that the only way forward? Can we think of a practical lifeline? I mean, first question, what is a reasonable lifeline that is worthy of subsidy or cross-subsidy? Or is there none?
Well, isn't the right answer here from just blackboard economics, maybe not common sense, is the redistribution policies are terrific and important. But once you start having them bleed into pricing and the operation of the grid, everyone starts to suffer from that. So you could have a direct benefit transfer program for people below a certain income level, and then have them pay, marginal costs like everyone else.
So you want them to pay a cost, average cost of supply, which is in the order of 7 rupees at the margin.
Well, I can't quite tell if you're saying average or marginal cost, but we would like to pay everyone we'd like everyone to pay marginal cost.
Okay.
Just to supplement on this, the question of cross subsidy. In fact, the present tariff policy gives a band of 20% plus minus from the average cost of supply within which the tariff has to be there.
In theory.
In theory. But then Bihar is a state where you will find that that band is adhered to, one of the rare states. There are other examples like Maharashtra. There are many examples where the industrial tariff is almost like 160% of the cost, and your domestic tariff is subsidized. It's cross subsidized. So it's an area where Government of India in the new tariff policy, which should be out any time, it is being addressed. As in the earlier tariff policy made it a guideline for the regulators to follow. Now the new tariff policy which is expected is likely to make it mandatory, and it is also giving a roadmap for phasing out cross subsidies, so that all categories across are paying the actual cost of supply. And if at all government as a policy wants to subsidize a particular category, then it's free to do so and subsidize a particular category. That too in the form of a DBT. That is what is the probably looking forward the
So leaving aside concerns some folks have on DBT missing the poorest of the poor, because coverage is a slight challenge. How much should it be? In the sense, it's very easy to say pay full costs or true costs of a commodity. The ice cream must be paid for, but you're then giving people upfront a certain amount, or maybe not upfront, maybe it's based on your actual consumption, so it could vary. But how much is worthy of it is not a techno-economic question, it's a policy, if not political question. But what is some experiences from around the world? I mean, it just seems to me 400 kilowatt hours a month is outrageously high if you're just targeting lifeline. So
Anant has some really interesting work on DBT. Maybe he wants to talk about that in agricultural areas.
Sure, but just absolutely. But also, if you go, thanks to LED technology, thanks to efficient consumption, the minimum required for a first rung on the energy ladder, a fan, maybe, of course, charge your mobile phone, maybe TV, is actually not that many kilowatt hours. But yet, when you look at the numbers that you've shown, the actual consumption is much, much higher. So is it just that that average is skewed by a few people using a lot more? Because we want to make sure we don't go too far up the curve into who's getting support.
Yeah, so I think the question of how much this transfer should be is, I think also it is a political question. I don't think there's an economic reason why it should be set at a particular level, even if we're thinking of lifeline energy, because it's ultimately redistribution of wealth. It might be a little more than the lifeline, but if it's an unconditional transfer, for instance, it's not distorting anything. Now, the project that I'm part of with agricultural consumers is what we are trying to say is, okay, when you're consuming electricity right now, you're costing so much. So let me make that your unconditional transfer. So I'll give you that money in cash, and then I'm going to charge you the full price. So if you don't change what you do, you're no worse off, but you will pay the full price. So if you increase consumption, you pay for that at the full price, and if you cut consumption, you're left with cash in hand. You respond to the right marginal price. Now, why did we pick that cash transfer? Well, you pick that cash transfer precisely because it leaves people no worse off, and therefore politically it's possible to get from distorted pricing to a transfer and then pricing that is at the marginal cost. So that's one way in which you might want to move, just because there needs to be a politically feasible way of getting from here to people paying full prices.
Rahul, I think the generic problem is that when you're trying to achieve two goals with one policy, it becomes a holy mess. And in some sense, that's kind of the theme of the Electricity is Not a Right paper, which is absolutely redistribution is important. But the problem is, since that's now got embedded in the way that electricity is supplied, your 400 kilowatt consumers in Delhi are benefiting. As we showed in Bihar, like half of the losses are occurring from the largest consumers in Bihar, which seems like exactly the opposite of what you want to do. And so I think all solutions that, at least my own view, is all solutions that are ultimately going to be durable are going to have to kind of cut off this idea that electricity is a right. But that does not mean that you shouldn't have redistribution and you shouldn't find ways to help people who don't have very high incomes to consume the good, but it should be separated from the operation of the system.
I think the fundamental point you're pointing to is that there are people who are not willing to pay receiving electricity, and then there's other, the very poor, and then there's others who are quite willing to pay, who are not receiving, and so sort of along the Sier cleaner lines, you want to reduce that misallocation, but separate from that point, because it's constraining the economy, separate from that point is you want to somehow bundle up a transfer, and that transfer doesn't just have to be for energy. It seems to me that a fundamental problem here is we sort of assume we know what the poor want. And so society will have to decide how much of a transfer should be made, but A, that should be made to people who are generally deserving, i.e. the poor, and then they decide, well, they're going to use it for energy, they're going to use it for food and so forth. And there's another separate set of issues around why are you doing multiple different transfers for different needs of the poor, which may or may not reflect their actual wishes. So that there maybe even need to think about DBT in a broader sense and not relating to kind of taking the subsidization out of electricity.
Absolutely.
That's the theme that shows up in the work on the solar microgrids. Is a lot of these folks don't actually value electrification very highly, and so if given more money, that what they're trying to say through their choices is they'd probably spend it on something else.
And absolutely, and this is where, in some places in India, kerosene subsidies, for example, would be a classic. If you applied a systems level view, you should put that money towards quality electricity supply, especially on the lighting front. Cooking is a whole separate, different issue on modern fuels and cleaner. We'll open it up to questions. There's some more discussions. We've had several hands. If you could keep it very, very brief. Lady over there on the right side, and then gentleman in the white next. So if we could just get mics. If you could, if it's directed to anyone in particular, please share that.
Yeah, hi, I'm a researcher in IIT and LSE alumnus. My question is to Professor Greenstone. You mentioned that on-grid, and since we have grids everywhere, there is no scope now for off-grids, and especially when you mention solar mini-grids. What's the future of solar mini-grids in India? And the other one is
we'd request you
just one.
Sorry, you can take it offline just to be fair.
Okay,
Thank
sure.
you.
I think what the results, again, which is not my view, it's just people expressing their preferences through their choices, would suggest that at current levels of income, there is some role for solar microgrids, but over time that's going to decline because people appear to want what the grid offers, which is way more load and the ability to run more consuming appliances.
Anything, yeah.
Yeah, anything. So. Now, there's one caveat to that, which is it is possible that the exact solar microgrid that we studied is, kind of a 1.0 version, and that over time solar microgrids will get better, and maybe that'd be different. But in the setting that we looked at, people, as they get richer, are going to want the grid.
So that's the standalone solar microgrid,
Yeah.
and you may evolve to synergistic microgrids that interact with the grid.
Yeah.
I'm Daljit Singh. I am independent researcher I work on the power sector. And, all of you put forth some really interesting policy options, but I think there's one factor that could very easily torpedo all this, and that's the state level politics. The electricity pricing is an electoral issue, and you can look at what has happened in Delhi. We had from the DVB days till after privatization, quality improved tremendously. But now, with Kejriwal giving this, with giving the subsidies, we're beginning to see the discoms suffer. And sooner or later, that'll affect the quality. But this also breaks that assumption that if you improve the quality, people will start paying more, because actually it's the politician who determines it, and it's very easy for this sort of populist measures which would just torpedo anything that you try to do. And this idea that you can differentiate pricing by areas that do well, you'll get you could charge different prices. That's not working. For example, in Delhi, even though TPDDL's costs are much lower, we've got uniform pricing throughout Delhi, even though the TPDDL prices could be much lower. And so trying to differentiate would be difficult.
Lady in the black.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question is for Mr. Lakshman and for Professor Robin. Now, the houses that have you studied, obviously there would be pakka houses, brick-built houses which have the meters and are not paying, or are we looking at the informal or the what we would call as the barsati or the shack houses? And in that context, then I'll take my question to Professor Robin, is that the people who are consuming electricity, would they then be the classic poor that we were talking about in the earlier session? Thank you.
In terms of the households, like it covers the entire village or the entire rural setting. So it obviously covers the pakka houses as well as the kacha houses. And just to respond on the previous remark, in terms of Delhi government announcing a subsidy, I believe the Delhi government should be paying for the subsidy. As long as they are paying, the distribution utility per se should not suffer. Where they don't pay the subsidy in time, then it becomes an issue.
Hello?
On the first point about political economy, I mean, obviously this is the primary issue here, that people have become accustomed to receiving low-priced electricity. I think the reason, and it's important, that we went to Bihar, I think it was 2012, that Nitish Kumar announced that he would not stand for re-election unless they made significant improvements in electricity access. And me and Michael decided, okay, time to go to Bihar. We were already in Bihar with the IGC, but time to go to Bihar and work on energy. So I think absolutely you're right. The reason we're working on Bihar is if Bihar can do it, then that starts to change the national discourse. And the fact that nearby Uttar Pradesh is making significant improvements, I think is starting to impress on others, that even in these very poor states. Now, of course, many other states have moved in completely the opposite direction. So this thing will always ebb and flow. One would hope in, say, a decade, that the norm in India would be for people to pay for their electricity, and that's what we're hoping at least. On the issue of, as was already mentioned, we're definitely focusing on the full set of households, and in the solar experiment we actually chose villages because they didn't have access to electricity to begin with. So what you're seeing both for the all of Bihar and for the solar experiment is very much covering the full set of households in Bihar, not just the people who are in the pucca houses. Thank you.
Sorry, I know we have a lot of hands up, but we are short of time. Any closing thoughts, or what don't we know? Where should new energy be spent? So clearly we have to continue the good work being done in several states across India, and of course the national government has very ambitious plans. But what else aren't we doing, or what else don't we know? New ideas or gaps?
Well, in terms of taking off from the remark only, actually it's a critical thing, because electricity is a concurrent subject. So state governments have their critical role in terms of how do they handle this sector. Because there are many examples where the states operationally, the utilities are doing really well, but because of the state government policy and not paying the subsidies in time, has actually led to serious issues in many utilities. So that is a area where how state policy actually looks at this sector is also critical if we have to collectively move forward.
I mean, so are improvements going to go to the discoms or to the consumers? There's always pressure in one direction.
Right.
I would say I think the main thing that I feel like has come out of our work so far is this realization that the social norm that electricity is a right is at the root of many of the problems we see. And one area that I think is super important that we don't have a very firm grasp on is how to change that social norm. And where did that social norm come from? Can it be changed? Because
India, the other example everyone touts is cell phones, where it has the lowest ARPUs, average revenue per user, in the world, and there is a willingness to pay, even though the quality, quite honestly, isn't that great either.
Yeah. So I think if we're looking at sort of the long run 15-year thing, then I think the point you raised about what role does politics play in all of this is super important. I think one open question is whether people value, so let's say for example, if you were talking about direct transfers, do people value quality more, or do people value price more, or do people value the flexibility of, say, having a cash transfer more, is an open question. I mean, there are examples from South America, for instance, where whole governments have fallen because of temporary blackouts. So it's not the case that it's universally true that price is the lever that people respond to most.
California had government change.
Exactly. So my sense is that ultimately is what might make this sustainable when governments realize that quality also is something that gets you votes.
So I guess my big sort of unknown is what I would call Korea. So there's a lot of evidence out there, well, not a lot, there's some evidence out there that the very poor are unwilling to pay, for example, for expensive electricity connections. And indeed, in our case, even for fully priced supply. Now, the question then, and why I call it Korea, is had you gone to Korea in the 1960s and said, okay, you guys are not willing to pay for connections or supply, so we're going to give you a solar panel, then we would not have Korea today. And so the big unknown is what's going to, as people across the country are now getting access paid for by the government, which I think is a sensible policy, so pay the fixed cost, but then let people pay the full marginal cost, what's going to happen? Is there going to be the kind of transformation that occurred in Korea. There's many other limiting factors on that. But I think that's a really big unknown, and I tend to err on the side of optimism on that. Even having known Bihar for 10 years, the changes in Bihar have been massive, and many of them driven by having access to electricity. So I think it's a wrong policy conclusion to say, okay, we see somebody today, we ask them, well, are you willing to pay for electricity? They say no, and then we say, well, we need to move to some alternative low supply solutions such as a solar panel on your roof. I think that would be the fundamentally wrong policy conclusion to draw, but of course I don't know what's going to actually happen. But I do think that from other parts of India we are seeing this sort of transformation which is being driven by not only electricity but many other forms of infrastructure.
I think that point is very key, that cheap shouldn't be bad quality is why it's cheap, because otherwise it's a recipe for disaster. We saw that in the first generation of electric vehicles, the two-wheelers. Because you had to keep the prices low, they were made with very bad range, and they gave a bad name to the entire technology space. So I think, on Korea, they were also very strict on catching people who stole.
Absolutely.
Like public electrocutions level strict. So I'm not advocating that. Maybe it wouldn't work. No. But I think the other takeaway from what you said, Robin and Michael, is just it's not one thing. It's not just improve the quality, improve the billing, improve the payment options, improve the choices. It's going to be a bit of all of the above. If we just focus only on one thing, it's unlikely to be a silver bullet. And that's true even of a smart meter, which needs to fit in an ecosystem of incentives, pricing, and gives you bang for buck. So this is a fast changing and moving space, but the signs are all positive, and hopefully we'll be asking different questions next time we meet. Thank you.